This is Clint Lanier, Assistant College Professor of Professional Communication at New Mexico State University. And today we're going to talk about fonts and words and stuff like that, and really how important they are to technical communication and to writing. First thing that you need to understand is that font affects meaning. In other words, font will affect not only how something looks, but what it really means. Now, I want you to take a look at a couple of things for me. This is a poem that I'd like you to read. Read it to yourself just briefly. It's written in a font called Chiller, which was introduced by Microsoft back in, I believe, the 1990s, and it's supposed to reflect some type of horror movie, like blood trickling down the wall or something like that. And the second font, the second poem, is written in also a Microsoft font, which is called Curls. And Curls is kind of a fun, playful looking font where the end of each of the letters kind of curls into itself and so forth. But read these two poems for a moment and to yourself, and just reflect on them. All right, you done? Well, this was drawn from a study that was performed here at New Mexico State University by a colleague of mine. And it was to show that what font actually does, what the type of font actually does to the meaning. That very first poem is actually a love poem. It's by Shakespeare. It's one of his sonnets. And it's a very uplifting poem. And that second poem, however, is a very dark poem. It was by a Scottish poet, a contemporary of Shakespeare. It's also a sonnet. But the second one is quite depressing, and the first one is actually quite cheerful. Now, if you were to take those and put those in just kind of a normal, regular font, you'd see that. Now, the study showed that the people who read a very uplifting poem, but in a very dark font, like this Chiller font here, had pretty negative things to say about the poem, that it was a dark poem, that it made them feel really bad, and so forth. Meanwhile, the second poem that used a font that was kind of playful or happy or uplifting, they said that that poem made them feel good about themselves. But read the words. That very first one, it shouldn't be a dark poem. It's saying that love alters not his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. In other words, love will conquer all. Love will conquer time and even death itself. That second one, though, is essentially saying there is no hope for any of us. That life is nothing but tragedy and pain, and there's never any relief. However, people said that that second poem made them feel good about themselves, even though it was a very dark poem, and it was obviously much darker than that very first one. So what are the lessons learned from this kind of experiment that was performed? First of all, fonts create images out of words. You have to understand that when our mind sees a piece of paper, when our mind reads something, it reads it very briefly, and it reads it in almost an instant. We've created a message from it, and font is part of that message. Font is part of that messaging. Fonts then create meaning outside of the text. So regardless of what the text says, that font is influencing how we feel about something, and this meaning then affects the whole of the message. Okay. Therefore, you want to use font that is appropriate to the subject and to the medium. So don't use silly fonts for resumes. There was a horrible movie that came out called Legally Blonde. And in that movie, the protagonist hands the law school professor her resume, and it was printed on pink paper, and I guess it was scented. And you can imagine that it was written in that type of Curls font, right? A really playful kind of fun font. Well, that would be silly, and obviously none of you would ever do that. You would never write a resume out with that silly kind of font and turn it into somebody in the hopes of getting a job. But the point is, fonts do that anyway, okay, regardless of what you're using. So we want to make sure that we pick the right types of font. Font also affects readability, okay? Fonts have something called serifs. Serifs are those little tails at the ends of letters that you'll see. You don't see them on these letters. These are actually sans serif fonts. So this is an example of a serif. You see that little tail that's circled, that's shaded in red there? This is Times New Roman, and Times New Roman is what we call a serif font because it has those little feet, or those little tails, or whatever you want to call it. The one next to it, however, is Arial. Arial is what they call a sans serif font. Sans means without serif. And so you'll see it doesn't have any of those little tails. Well, using these fonts, using these different types of fonts, really does affect how easy it is to read something. Let me give you an example. Well, serifs break up the letters and create a transition for the eye. That's how they affect readability. So here's an example. This is a mixed case row of letters of capital I and lowercase l in Arial, so in sans serif font. And can you distinguish one from the other? If you look closely, you'll see that some are closer together than others, but you can't really be sure which is which. Now, I took this example from something that happened to me. I was given a password printed out on a piece of paper, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out what the password was, and it had about 3 of these things. Now, the problem was it was printed out in Arial font. When it was printed out in a different font, I could see that these were different letters. I just thought they were all either capital I's or lowercase l's. There was no way I was going to get that password. Let me show you the exact same row of letters if we use a serif font. Okay, so now you can see, oh, my apologies. This is still in the same font. This is Arial, but now you can see where the lowercase, where the I's are and where the L's are. If I change the cases around, you can see what they look like. The one on top would be impossible to understand, okay? And again, this is the exact same case, capital I, lowercase l, but if we use serif fonts, that little tail allows us to distinguish the difference between the letters. Okay, so font affects readability. Here's another example. This is what we call a serif font, and these are those kind of calligraphy-looking fonts that you see on wedding announcements and graduation announcements and so forth. So this is the preamble to the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, written in this kind of very serif type of font, almost calligraphy or handwriting, and it's very difficult to read, versus something in, say, Times New Roman. Style can also affect the readability of something. So how you actually stylize your font. So all capped versus mixed case. All capped is more difficult to read than mixed case. So on the left, you see it in all caps, 7 years ago, and on the right, you see it in mixed case, as we call it. Now, the reason why it's so difficult to read is because in the mixed case, your eye can travel up and down and distinguish letters very easily and without a lot of problems. The letters on the left, however, they're all the same height. So there's nothing to break up and distinguish the letters. The Y, for example, in towards the bottom lines in Liberty is the same height as the T that's next to it. However, if we move to the right and we see conceived in Liberty, you see that Y goes down below the T, so it's easy to distinguish it. And remember, we do this in an instant. We don't have to sit there and stare at these letters. Our mind automatically jumps to these points without us even knowing it. Some other ways that style can affect readability as far as font is concerned are bolding, italicized, and underlining letters. Okay. For screen text, sans serif font can be a lot easier to read, and it's because the serifs sometimes do not distinguish properly due to resolution issues. Now, that we can say that seems to be going away with newer, larger monitors, and that was the case. However, now with the use of mobile devices, I'm sure all of you are browsing the internet or checking Facebook or whatever on your phones all the time. So I think using a sans serif font for online is still probably important. Words need to be framed. This is something else I want you to consider, is that there needs to be space around words. There's something called the Gestalt principle, which means form. Okay, words within a paragraph create a form. You'll notice that there's space around a paragraph, and that frames that paragraph, and it lets us know that that paragraph is kind of one unit, as are letters and as are words within that paragraph. Paragraphs as form create meaning. It's metadata, and that's what we call it when we quickly or instantaneously recognize something on a page. Okay, elements on a page or a screen must be framed in order to create some type of form. In other words, in order for us to quickly see and understand information, it has to be framed by white space, just as these bullets are framed by the white space or by the space in the background of this slide. So use white space to frame elements, smaller spaces between smaller items and smaller spaces between items that are alike. Okay, so in other words, if you have a chapter heading, you want the chapter heading to be close to the information that follows it because those two things are related.